This is Global Tennessee, news, analysis, and commentary from the Tennessee World Affairs Council in Nashville. Global Tennessee is produced in association with the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational association, and the views expressed on Global Tennessee are those of the participants.
Welcome to Global Engagement. This is a World Affairs Council Global Affairs Awareness Project that connects you with current events. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. We're starting this during the stay-at-home period of the pandemic response, especially as students are working from home and can find this useful information as they seek to understand what's happening in the world. Each week, we'll share 5 important topics from the news and provide background, context, and analysis. And we'll get you involved through the webinar's interactive features. Global Engagement will be broadcast live every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central Time as a webinar on Zoom where you can participate with your questions and comments. The series will be archived on the Tennessee World Affairs Council's YouTube channel and by audio on our Global Tennessee podcast. You can find links to all of the episodes on our website. That's TNWAC.org. Let me introduce my co-host for Global Engagement, Ambassador Dick Bowers. He retired after a distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service with postings around the world, including as United States Ambassador to Bolivia. In addition to extensive service work in the community, including teaching ESL to new Americans, Ambassador Bowers has served on the World Affairs Council board for 8 years. Dick, can you talk about the new webinars being offered by the World Affairs Council?
I can indeed, Pat. Before I do that, though, let me just make sure that our viewers or listeners know who you are. Patrick Ryan is the president of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. In fact, was instrumental in founding it over a dozen years ago. Pat was also in the U.S. Navy, had a distinguished career, and mostly at the end of it was doing intelligence kind of work in the Middle East, which led to his working as a civilian, producing a newsletter for a number of years about things Middle East. But back to the new programs we're going to have. Because of our current circumstances and social distancing, we're going Zoom. And we're pleased to be pivoting from our in-person global programs to this format so we continue our awareness efforts and in fact probably expand our outreach with new programs and new people watching and listening. So in addition to this program, Global Engagement, which we are shooting to be shown every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, as Pat mentioned, we are launching a Tuesday evening series at 7 p.m. Central Time every week. The show that in that 7 p.m. time hour will alternate. There'll be one show one week and a different show the next week, and then the first show will pick up again. So the first one is going to be Global Nashville with Carl Dean. In this interactive webinar, former Nashville Mayor Carl Dean will talk with guests and with you about the things that make Nashville a global city. The program will also focus on the impact of the pandemic on the global aspects of the city and what we should prepare for and how we should shape our new normal on the other side of the pandemic. The program with Mayor Dean will alternate with a new video version of Global Dialogue. This is our Global Affairs Speakers Program. And just like the Speakers Town Halls that we had for a number of years in partnership with Belmont University, we will present distinguished guests, including foreign and American diplomats, business leaders, military officers, scholars, non-governmental leaders, and others. So be sure to add Tuesday at 7 p.m. to your calendar to see and participate in Global Nashville and Global Dialogue, our guest speakers program. So I think that wraps it up, Pat. Basically, you got 2 things every Tuesday to watch. Me and my buddy Pat, and then one of the other programs in the evening.
Great, thanks, thanks, Dick. That's a lot of global stuff. Before we get into the news, I'd like to just bring everyone up to date on our education outreach program, especially for the students who might be watching. We have a number of programs for students. One that is basically our flagship program is called Academic WorldQuest. It's a competition between high school teams, 4 students to a team, multiple choice questions in 10 topics that we provide a study guide for. And we recently wrapped up the championship match for Academic WorldQuest for this year. Unfortunately, the national competition, due to the social distancing and the problems of travel, has been postponed and probably will not be held this year. But we're looking forward to September of organizing teams again for Academic WorldQuest. So if you're looking for some form of learning about the world, studying about the world, and competing with other high schools or even within your school, take a look at our website, TNWAC.org, for Academic WorldQuest. One thing that you can get involved with is the Tennessee Global Scholar Certificate Program. This is a program where you earn points by participating in various international affairs activities. Some of those could be programs like this. They could be the Model UN, if you were on a WorldQuest team, or very many other activities that involve interest in global affairs. You can receive credit and eventually earn the Tennessee Global Scholar Certificate, which is a medallion and a certificate which you can present on your credentials for college applications, and also just to demonstrate that you are interested in what's going on in the world and that you've achieved a certain level of interest. Lastly, I'll mention the weekly quiz. This is something that can keep you up to date on what's going on in the world. Every day we post on Twitter, we tweet out current events, we curate news articles and post those with the hashtag TNWAC quiz. And those news items go into the weekly quiz every Monday at 10 a.m. Comes out in the newsletter on our website, and you can participate in the quiz and possibly earn some opportunity to win a prize that we offer. But the reward is knowing what's going on in the world and keeping up to date and understanding global developments. So those are our education outreach programs. Again, go to tnwac.org for more information. Just click on the menu bar under education, and you'll see a long list of opportunities for you to get involved with. And I think that's it for our education outreach. And on to the news.
On to the news. So we have what? You have 5 topics going to talk about. Let me just tick them off and then we'll start and go through them. Number 1 is the COVID-19 update. So what's going on, probably a little bit here and what's going on in the world. This is the number 1 story going everywhere in the world. Number 2, the United Kingdom. What's happening in the United Kingdom? And number 3, US-Iran developments. So there have been some movement in our activity vis-a-vis the Iranians. 4 is global governance and democracy, an interesting kind of topic. What's the effect that this COVID-19 pandemic is going to have on our ability to govern ourselves and be part of the governance of the world? And finally, Afghanistan and America's longest war. What is going on there? What should be going on there? What it looks like we're having a breakthrough, but maybe we're really not. So we've got a lot to talk about, Pat. So how about COVID-19 update?
Well, let's first tell everybody that this inaugural edition of Global Engagement is being recorded on Monday, April 6th, and will be presented on Tuesday, April 7th. So the information that you get, and with the global pandemic, the information is changing every hour. So we encourage you to stay up to date in reliable news sources about what's happening. But a couple of key items that have made the news this week. We turned to Japan, where last week, Dick, they canceled, excuse me, they didn't cancel, they postponed the 2020 Olympics. It was set for Tokyo at the end of July and into August. And given the issues with travel and social distancing and the uncertainty of what would be happening in July and August. They postponed it one full year. So they're still going to call it, interestingly enough, the 2020 Olympics, but it will actually be held in Tokyo in 2021, July and August. And that goes as well for the Paralympics, which typically accompany right after an Olympic Games, the Paralympics. Meanwhile, there's been a state of emergency declared in some cities. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has declared a state of emergency to tackle the coronavirus pandemic. Now, you may recall that shortly after the outbreak in China, there were a number of cases in Japan, and they quickly implemented social distancing and travel restrictions on people entering the country and so forth, along with South Korea. And the situation in Japan seemed to have been under control, but they've announced a number of new infections and have declared a state of emergency in the capital, Tokyo, and other major cities.
Can I put you on the spot with a question, Pat?
That depends. Go ahead.
If you were in Japan, would you stay there, or would you try to get back here as quick as you could? And vice versa. If you're here and you're Japanese, would you stay here, or would you try to get back home as quick as you could?
I think it's going to be based on your circumstances. If it depends on, I think, what city you would be located in. In Japan, obviously, Tokyo is in a state of emergency. There are many other cities in Japan where the problem is not as severe. Like the United States, we have hotspots right now in New York City, New Orleans. I think Detroit is making the list. Nashville, we're seeing a very significant rise in cases. So a lot of it is going to depend on where you are, what your circumstances are. The healthcare in Japan is world class. So that's not an issue. There's also the question of traveling. If we're concerned about social distancing, do you want to get on a plane for 12, 13, 14 hours with people who may have non-symptomatic COVID-19? And then what will your circumstances be when you arrive back in the States? Not everyone's healthcare situation is equal here. So it's a toss-up. It's a tough question to answer. And again, I think it's situational.
Well, probably too, you're going to get to the point where you will not be able to get on a flight even if you wanted to do it. I mean, I think things continue to shut down, and as more and more countries are taking this more and more seriously, and as they should.
Right.
And while the focus here, if you watch the news in the United States, it's 99% or 95% what's going on in the United States with the virus. But this is a worldwide pandemic, and there are things going on everywhere in the world. I just read, for example, 3 members of Burkina Faso's cabinet, the Interior Ministry and Education guy, I think, and the Agriculture guy, all have coronavirus. So where's Burkina Faso? That's a question for you students to look up. But it's got another name that it used to have. And the capital city of Burkina Faso is? Ouagadougou.
I'm sorry, I didn't. I knew the answer to that. I thought you were posing that to our.
Well, I could, yeah, fine.
Rhetorically.
So
but yes, I did know that.
Are you? What kind of things are you doing, Pat, on the coronavirus? Are you staying home and?
I am a stay-at-home guy, 24/7. We make an occasional outing to pick up some essential supplies and an occasional trip to the pharmacy. But otherwise, we're here 24/7 in our downtown Nashville home, and are just waiting it out to see what happens. You know, you get in a certain age group, and they advise you to. You know, we've been hunkered down here for probably longer than most stay-at-home people, but I would encourage everyone to follow the governor and the mayor's recommendations and guidelines, the CDC guidelines, to stay at home, limit contact, wash your hands, observe good hygiene. And now I guess the recommendation is to wear a mask when you go out. And importantly, some people may interpret the guidelines on having a mask as being kind of a defense against exposure when you're out. So, but don't feel that a mask is now your, this.
No, I think the word out there from the CDC is the mask is more to prevent you from infecting others than it is from
Right.
breathing in something that could infect you. And
Right.
you never know. I mean, the thing that makes most sense to me, act as if you have it. And you don't want to go out there and infect other folks.
And I think act as if everybody you encounter has it.
Amen.
And especially, you're out shopping and whatever and touching surfaces. But we digress from what's going on in the world. So let's jump to Italy, where Italy, the cases in Italy have plateaued. Italy is still the principal epicenter of infections in Europe. They had a tremendous problem in the north, and then it has spread throughout the country. South of Naples and south of Rome, not as much, but there are some cases. The real serious problems are in the north, stretching the arc across from Genoa in the west to Venice in the east, across the industrial belt, Milan, Bergamo, some of the other cities in the north were especially hard hit. They experienced shortages of ventilators, every sort of PPE, the protective equipment to deal with it, and they had a horrendous number of deaths associated with it. I think, Dick, the United States has surpassed Italy in total number of infections and deaths, and we're tracking. Every once in a while you see a 4 or 5 line diagram showing trajectory of countries, and I think the United States sadly is on the trajectory of some of the cases that did not go so well. Italy, Spain.
Yeah, we're still going up. We have not hit the hump yet. So it's everybody in the States was talking about this is going to be the worst week ever. So we'll have to see. Interestingly, in Europe, how the European Union, as the European Union, really has not taken on this problem. Individual countries have reverted back to their own sovereign territory and their own sovereign ways of doing things. And different countries are doing very different things. I mean,
Sure.
The Swedes are kind of an oddball out there where they have not tightened up as much as the other Scandinavian countries have. The Danes have been, on the economic side, the spinoff from COVID-19, have been very proactive, but in a way very different than the United States. They are giving governmental subsidies to businesses to keep people on the payroll. So our program basically is we're going to send a check to everybody and they can do what they want with it. Danes and others in Europe are saying, keep these people on the payroll, keep them as your employees, and we'll be ready to ramp back up once we can get out and start working again. I think
part of the CARES Act does include provisions for businesses in the United States to get supplements from the government as long as they keep people on the payroll.
Okay.
I think there are 2 programs. Yeah, and it's not just businesses, but nonprofit organizations such as ours could possibly participate in that. It's kind of slow in the rollout, but we'll see how that goes. But you make an interesting point that in the European Union, two things that are worth mention. The countries do seem to be looking at unilateral approaches rather than the European Union-wide approach to dealing with the pandemic. Italy, Spain, and France asked the European Union, the Parliament, to put some legislation in place for European Union-wide remedies to the pandemic, or at least some tools that that governments could use, and the Germans objected to it. So there's not unanimity in the EU on how to deal with the pandemic. The other thing that I've heard discussed on some podcasts and elsewhere is that the European Union, most of the countries in the European Union have universal health care.
Yeah.
So if someone loses their job, they don't lose their health care, and there are no uninsured residents of those countries. So those are
It's a
issues
huge difference.
that we're finding to be particularly hard for people to deal with in this time of crisis. So
You know, one of the
things to
things that
consider.
I have not heard much about, what's going on in Russia. And I had the opportunity about a week ago. You can read Pravda in English. Basically, if you just Google Pravda newspaper, it comes up in Russian, but you can translate it. They have some very interesting, bizarre things going on, including the idea that somehow the West started all this. That this is just a plot from the U.S. military, right? That
Yeah.
got out of hand.
Well, that propaganda is also being spread by some entities originating in China, and that's led to a lot of pushback in the United States. That this was supposedly concoction in an army laboratory somewhere, which is patently false.
Nonsense.
But there are people in the United States pushing back. We noticed for a while the president was calling it the Chinese virus. The Secretary of State was calling it the Wuhan virus. And I think after President Trump had a phone call with President Xi, that language seemingly has eased up. I don't know what the nature of the phone call was, but hopefully we can get past the war of words and work together more closely on dealing with the pandemic.
Well, the Asians seem to be, they're ahead of us on this. We started the same day as South Korea by having our first case and their first case, and they did a much better job than we in shutting it down. And they're way ahead of us in terms of flattening their curve out.
Right.
We're still spiking up. So Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, they did a much better job of controlling this thing than we've done. So we have a lot of lessons to learn once this thing shakes out.
Right. As the Surgeon General said over the weekend, this week, the week of April 6th, is going to be a particularly rough week in the United States. So, we'll see where we are on that curve, whether we're flattening it out or continue to rise in a trajectory similar to places like Italy and Spain.
Yeah.
While we're on Europe, let's turn to our second topic, Dick, the United Kingdom.
Well, the Queen didn't say, stay calm and carry on, but she said, remain united and resolute. So the Queen has, I think, for the 5th time in her reign, spoken out, other than at her annual Christmas message. And the big news, which happened just before we came on the air here, is that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been admitted to intensive care. Early on, he was somewhat of a denier, and this is not going to be a big thing. He didn't take the preventive steps. He was out glad-handing and mixing and mingling and doing things. And unfortunately, he's paying a heavy price for it now. So the government is now being run by his second in line while he is in intensive care. And we pray for him and God bless him. I hope he comes through this without a problem.
Right. It wasn't until about a week or so ago that the United Kingdom saw that they were in a bad place and instituted a major crackdown, and people caught out on the street without a purpose of where they're going, what they're doing, can be arrested or fined heavily. So the United Kingdom is they're in the middle of it like we are, and are similarly to the United States, trying to catch up.
Well, all of these things, the spin-off from all of this stuff, Pat, for example, in Western Europe, they're in the midst of either planting or starting to begin to think about harvesting vegetables and things of this sort. They rely heavily upon East Europeans to come in and do a lot of that work. And now with no movement, who's going to pick these crops? Who's going to plant these crops? What's going to happen? And this could spin over in terms of availability of food. France, Spain. Spain is another one that's been hit very, very hard, right? And Germany seems to be locked down, but doing better than some of its southern neighbors, for example.
Well, another aspect of that is Brexit. You know, we went through months and months of the Brexit, or actually years of Brexit talks, only to see in January that Brexit actually took place on the 31st.
Yeah.
And there's an 11-month run-up to a final negotiation between the European Union and the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom has clamped down on migration and travel into the United Kingdom. So you're right. There's going to be a lot of consequences for the normal flows of people to get business done.
Yeah.
One thing that hit the news over the weekend as well is that the United Kingdom has a new leader of the opposition Labour Party. You probably recall, Dick, that in December there was a major victory. Boris Johnson, the head of the Conservatives, won a significant victory over the Labour Party, bolstering his Brexit program and also ensuring that the Conservatives are in power for the foreseeable future. But the new Labour Party leader replacing Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, who was criticized heavily for being too far to the left, he's being replaced by Keir, that's K-E-I-R, Starmer, who's a former prosecutor and human rights attorney. So he brings some liberal ideas to his position as head of the Labour Party. But he's also seen as somebody who does his homework. He's a details-oriented sort of guy. So a lot of people who look at Boris Johnson or Bojo, as some people lovingly call him, as being more of a flamboyant, charismatic figure. So the competition between Labor and Conservative is now being branded as a battle between competence and charisma.
There you go. So how's your British jurisprudence, for example? If Boris Johnson cannot serve, what happens?
Well, he's, I don't want to say I'm winging this, but I suspect that he would be replaced by someone named by his party, because in the in the British system, the parliamentarian system, the prime minister is nominated by the ruling party, and the Conservatives still are the ruling party. So
the Queen has a role in this, right? She has to
well,
kind of accept
the Queen is the Queen is the head of state. The
right.
Prime Minister is the head of government, and under the British system, Queen Elizabeth has an honorific position in approving the appointment of the Prime Minister. But I don't know what would happen if she said, no, I don't like that guy or gal, and you know, that's a whole deeper level of Britishness that we'll have to research, Dick.
All right.
Okay, on to topic 3. I think I'll take the lead on this one, Dick. U.S.-Iran relations, and a couple of things in the news. One that I can share with you from Monday, April 6th. There was a press conference. A group of distinguished American and European leaders from diplomacy, officials from government, senators, and so forth. In total, 24, including Madeleine Albright, Thomas Pickering, Frank Wisner, the last 2 of those who have been here at the Tennessee World Affairs Council in our speakers program. This group got together and they organized a joint statement called the Transatlantic Call to Ease Humanitarian Trade with Iran due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, you probably know, Dick, that Iran, of all the Middle East countries, was hit particularly hard by the coronavirus. It started in the holy city of Qom, Q-O-M, which is their center of religious activity in the Shiite branch of the Islamic faith, and a number of pilgrims who go to the holy city spread the coronavirus around Iran, and it stretched even outside the borders of Iran. Shiites who traveled to other countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, some Shiites who traveled to Sunni-dominated Muslim countries were also infected. So the city of Qom is an epicenter for a breakout in the Middle East, and it's come at a time for Iran as they're suffering from the sanctions following the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. Their economy is in very bad shape, and now they're dealing with the COVID-19 virus. So this group of 24 distinguished people got together and in this press conference talked about the necessity to provide humanitarian assistance, that the assistance would be in the form of loans, for example, from the International Monetary Fund, would not be necessarily cash, because some people are worrying that the government of Iran might take the cash and use it, for example, through the Revolutionary Guard Corps for malevolent purposes, but would be in the form of medical technology and pharmaceuticals and so forth. So that's on the table this week, the joint statement on
Do you think the
COVID-19.
Trump administration will show any interest in backing off some of the sanctions? And if they were to do that, would that provide an opening perhaps for beginning of a little more budding diplomacy than we've seen, besides saber rattling and in your face kind of diplomacy?
Well, that's a good question. And that was a question posed in the press conference I listened in on, the question of what would the Trump administration reaction be. And Ambassador Thomas Pickering, from your club of ambassadors, he
Career Foreign Service officer, came up through the ranks. Tom Pickering
Yes.
is one of our finest.
Yes, he's an incredible guy, and we were very fortunate to have him here in Nashville,
Yeah.
talking to students and the community. But he and some others mentioned that there are actually mechanisms in place, even despite the post-Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA,
Yeah.
the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is really
Still in force with the Europeans, and
it's
right?
still in force with the Europeans, but it's
And the Chinese are still on board.
it's the permanent five plus
Yeah.
Germany
Germany.
and the European Union.
Yeah.
Now it's without the U.S., but there are procedures and mechanisms in place. The problem is that the Trump administration has been under its maximum pressure campaign, pushing institutions um, aggressively, and a lot of banks don't know. They're reluctant to get in the middle of it,
Yeah.
even though there is a permissive environment to some extent. So the statement calls for the Trump administration to work with the IMF and other international organizations to assist in bringing about some sort of medical relief to Iran as they suffer, like many other countries in the world, through this pandemic.
So one of the issues there as well, Pat, I think, is the reliability of the data. In some countries, you can be pretty well assured that what the government's putting out is what's actually going on and what
Sure.
they're counting. In others, there's a lot of fudging going on for local political reasons usually, or they just don't know because they haven't done enough testing and they have no idea how many people are really sick. So
Right.
and with the Iranians, the word on the street is that they have not been as open and honest as they might be.
Right. If you look around the world, China, Iran, and some other countries, the numbers really beg closer inspection, especially as anecdotal information comes out, especially in places like Wuhan in China, where the number of people who really
Right.
are believed to have perished are about 10 times what the Chinese are saying. But yeah, you're right. Not just in terms of the pandemic, but in probably every endeavor, if you have to look
And sort of
look look hard at the numbers.
Quick follow-on. Do you think the Iranians would be willing to send some signals that they're willing to take some steps that would sort of sweeten the pot, if you will? I mean, there
That was
are a number of people in jail in Iran that we're trying to get out, among other things.
Those issues were discussed in the press conference, and it played out that people believed behind the scenes diplomacy, where some of these things happened without a lot of fanfare on either side.
Yeah,
whether it was the United
just
States saying that we're doing these things for the Iranians, and likewise the Iranians not playing up so much that they were receiving American aid, which for some people there would be a problem. And likewise, politically in the United States, to be seen as helping Iran would be a problem. I should add that the other issue in the news with regard to Iran has been the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, as you know, Dick.
Hezbollah.
Well, yeah,
the militias, like
militias in Iraq, not Hezbollah in
right. I'm sorry.
In Lebanon, but the PMF forces that were involved in attacks on the embassy, rocket attacks against our bases where we still have U.S. troops. The United States reacted to some of that activity with the killing of Qasem Soleimani in January, which resulted in a missile bombardment directly from Iran of a base, two bases in northern Iraq. And that back and forth has been going on. Meanwhile, the Trump administration, President Trump himself, said that if that continued, he would, quote, go up the food chain, which means that the United States would not only deal with the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, but would look to Iran, to Tehran, as being the source of that mischief, and would do something.
Is that a threat of war?
It is a threat of some form. And since we have been applying maximum pressure, one could only conclude that it is not a threat of economic activity, because we've already exhausted almost every aspect of economic pressure.
Full out on that score, right?
So someone would assume that.
Well, from Dick Bauer's point of view, this is an opportunity for us to take a step forward, lessen the tensions, do something that's humanitarianly right, and moral, and just, and good, and hopefully it would be matched by positive steps on the other side, and we lessen the tensions and do a little détente, right, where we can work better than we have in the past. So I'm hopeful.
Well, you're over in you come from Foggy Bottom, the State Department, and I spent time in the Pentagon, so I think we're well matched here to provide a good give and take. I suspect that's going to be a tough sell in Washington, no matter how many diplomats sign on to the statement. But we'll see what happens. There is some noise within the Trump administration to try to extend a hand. We're running long on talking about topics, so let's jump to the next one, Dick.
Well, global governance and democracy. You young students who are out there watching this for the first time, you are living in unprecedented historical times. In my lifetime, nothing in the history of the world is like this since the Second World War. In that Second World War, the United States and the rest of the world basically mobilized to carry out and win that war, the good guys. We are now in a fight to win and save our democracy and our economy and how our way of life is going to be. And this is going to be a very, very hard task. And I know, Pat, that you just read a very interesting article about the threats that are posed by the pandemic to good governance and democracy. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I would encourage students and others out there to take a look at a number of think tanks in Washington and New York And think tanks get get kicked around in talking about the government and in politics, but there really are a lot of good studies that come out of these, and you can either scan them every once in a while, or actually sign up for their newsletters on areas that might be of interest to you. One of them is the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR.org. Another good one is the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's CSIS.org. And one that I also get the newsletter from is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And their web address is carnegieendowment.org. There's a study out dated April 6th, a commentary from Brown, Breckenmacher, and Carruthers. And the title of it is, How Will the Coronavirus Reshape Democracy and Governance Globally? And the piece makes 4 points specifically talking about what democracy, the challenges to democracy, and the areas that stand out, areas of concern, as during the pandemic, new emergency powers are being put in place by some regimes around the world. Some of them who are already exercising more authoritarian grasp on power, and some of them that may come to it as a result of the pandemic. And one of those, starting out the areas of concern, the first one is centralization of power. And I'll take through these, Dick, and then we can kick it around a little bit. So centralization of power is the first one. Leaders taking advantage of the crisis. The abridgment of fundamental rights. And some of that goes along with centralization of power. The third item of concern in the Carruthers piece is expanded state surveillance. Now, there are some places where they're notorious, like China and Xinjiang province, and around the country for having a surveillance state. And the last one is banishing protest. And you can see some of these are specifically aligned with our Bill of Rights, the freedom to assemble, the freedom of speech, are basic freedoms. But these in many countries are under attack. Dick, I know you had a great conversation in the first episode of Global Nashville with Carl Dean, as we took kind of a tour d'horizon of what was happening around the world. And you made the point that especially in the third world, we could see shaky democracies losing their way.
Absolutely. I mean, we're sitting here in Nashville, and I think we're doing a pretty good job with this social distancing. But imagine you're living in Soweto in South Africa, where probably half the people don't even have running water. How are you going to wash your hands all the time? And you're packed, maybe 8 or 10 people into one room. Well, much of the world lives that way. So when this cauldron of passing these viruses around starts growing, and people, what do they want to do? Where do they get their food? They live in an economy where they're out there every day having to try to do the best they can to sell something or barter something so they can live. So it's going to be a real tough row for much of the world. And we haven't seen that. I think most of the countries in Africa and Latin and South America are behind us in the wave, in the spike. I'm concerned that there'll be some real breakdowns and some revolutions and civil wars going on as riots take over and people get so desperate that they don't know what else to do but take to the streets.
Well,
and
that's
where. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's one more consequence of the pandemic. The push from the bottom pushing up.
Right.
I think what this Carnegie piece is talking about is the push from the top down in terms of accumulation of power. The case in, we had it on our list here. Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example. Recently, his ruling party voted in Parliament to give him indefinite rule by decree. And they've already started cracking down on journalists. People in the medical profession are reluctant to speak out for fear of being
Yeah.
jailed concerning the rates of testing and infection from the pandemic. So some governments, in using the ruse of the reacting to the pandemic, are simply accumulating
Use the
power.
pandemic as a cover to go ahead and seize more power. Orban, for example, has over the number of years been weakening various institutions, especially the press and the courts. And now his party is very loyal to him in the legislature, and they just basically passed a carte blanche that he can do whatever he wants to do. So the checks and balances are not going to be there. And this is the first European democratic country where this has occurred.
Right.
I don't know if it's going to be the last, because we have some other countries out there that have that potential, I believe.
Well, Poland has been criticized for suppression of freedom in the judiciary, for example. The
Right.
European Union,
Turkey's another issue with the problem with Erdogan.
even before the pandemic, Poland was an issue. But we're
Right.
seeing it not just in Europe, also Rodrigo Duterte, the president of the Philippines, and in Cambodia, there's a new draft law that is looking at rule by decree.
You see this sort of coming home to roost here, Pat, when you find that our governor realizes that we need to do this social separation to try to stop this coronavirus in its tracks. But at the same time, he's talking about, well, we don't want to trample on individual liberties. Well, frankly, I don't see how you do both. You're either going to try to stop the virus, or you're going to say you do what you want, and in which case the virus is going to spread like crazy.
Right.
So
and
it's an issue.
I think public health concerns have been tested in the judiciary in terms of constitutionality and have withstood those kinds of challenges. Okay, so we talked about Orban. Any other suppression of liberty and democracy and governance you want to
Brazil's
close
out there
with before we move on?
Jair Bolsonaro, and he's another one of the kind of corona deniers. And he's been out and about saying it's all just like the flu. You don't have to worry about it.
Back to work.
Brazil is going to really get smacked, because they're another one of these countries where you got the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots live in very tight, steamy quarters. Part of the issue, which has not been looked at sufficiently, I believe, is the climate difference. We are coming into spring. They are going into winter. Traditionally, these kind of viruses, like the flu, this is a winter kind of thing. And when the summer comes, it gets hotter, the virus has a tougher time getting around. So whether that'll make a difference between North and South America, I'm not sure. But right now, all of the countries in Latin America have the virus, and it's growing.
Yeah, not just Latin America, but all of the southern hemisphere countries.
Yeah, Africa.
Africa is going to be in
Australia.
In big trouble. Yeah, the southern hemisphere. It's not just a theory. It's looking like the outbreaks are starting to spread.
So this is a research question for our students out there. Is there a country in the world that does not yet have a case of coronavirus? 6th of April, 2020. I don't think so. I think maybe Antarctica is virus free.
If you find an answer, send an email to Ambassador Bowers at TNWAC.org, and I suspect he'll have a prize.
We'll have a prize for you. Okay.
Okay, our last topic is Afghanistan, and there's been some news there. Dick, do you want to jump in on that?
For months, the United States has led the effort to try to cut a deal with the Taliban. The Taliban are the groups of Muslim fundamentalists that are basically trying to take down the government and take over and make the country the way they want it.
Just a little background and context. The Taliban actually governed Afghanistan prior to 9/11.
They governed it on 9/11, and then we went in and asked them to give up, right, the
Right.
guys
They
did the job
hosted Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, who
and refused to
launched
give him up, and that's why we went in to get him.
launched their attacks on the United States, and the Taliban
Right.
did not want to turn them over. So the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, and the Taliban retreated to positions out of the cities and towns, but continued to battle with the United States and the Afghan security forces from safe havens and across the border in northern Pakistan and other regions of Afghanistan. So I'm sorry, Dick, go ahead.
No, so an American diplomat, Karzai, has been, no, Ahmedi Kalasi, what's his name? Have to check it out, sorry. Anyway, we have negotiated a deal with the Taliban. And that deal was negotiated between the United States and the Taliban, and it did not include the Afghan government in the deal. So now we have an issue of trying to get the Afghan government to come on board and do what's necessary with the deal. Part of the problem there is there are two people after recent elections that say they are the head of the Afghan government. Meanwhile, the Taliban has sent a group into Kabul because part of the deal is the release of some 6,000 Taliban prisoners. So this is all swirling around, and meanwhile the Taliban is saying that the deal is on the point of being broken. And we don't know what's going to happen. So stay tuned on that one.
The name you're hunting there is Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad.
That's it.
He's an Afghan American who was U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, and now he's heading up the peace talks. He has been engaged in peace talks. They were in the Persian Gulf and the United Arab Emirates talking for some time, and yeah, they're close to reaching an agreement. Well, they had an agreement. It's just a matter of implementing it. The Afghan government is reluctant to get involved.
Whoever that Afghan government may be.
Well, that's a complicating item in the news.
Abdullah, right? And Mr.
Right. The United States has threatened to withhold $1 billion in aid to Afghanistan. This week, it's come out in the news, and 3/4 of the Afghan security forces rely on money from that international assistance from the United States. And the problem that the United States is trying to resolve is a competition at the head of the Afghan government between the president, Ashraf Ghani, and the title is Chief Executive Officer, but he's the political rival of the president. His name is Abdullah, and the two of them have been competitors for years now. And the most recent election was not decisive. So the two of them are in relative positions of power, but unable to come to an agreement on how to deal with the results of the negotiation with the Taliban. So stay tuned. It's only been 19 years since the United States has been
our longest war ever
has been fighting in Afghanistan, and the current administration is trying to bring that to a close. So more to come on that. So Dick, that's our 5 topics.
Quick tour of the horizon, huh?
Thanks for the read through on that. Speaking of reading, I think you said you had a book that you wanted to share.
I do, and this is a great read, right? Prisoners of Geography. Basically, the thesis is a foreign policy, the politics of a country are going to be dictated by its geography. And I would highly recommend it. I'm halfway through. I have agreed totally with this guy. It's well written, well researched, lots of good stuff. I'm a geography nut anyway, so get this book, and you can get it online, Kindle. Enjoy.
Keep holding that up. I want to make one point. You reminded me of something, the weekly quiz. That book was on our list of quiz prizes just a couple of months ago. So there's a quiz taker out there in the World Affairs Council community who's got that book in hand, and I'm sure they're having a good read of it. So that's the kind of thing that we award as prizes to quiz winners. And Dick, I've got a book I'd recommend, and this is A Problem from Hell by Samantha Power. She was the United States
yeah.
ambassador to the United Nations. Not a career diplomat, but she started out as a journalist and worked in the Balkans and wrote this
She's
book.
a career internationalist. She's been in the field a long, long time.
Yeah, she wrote this book about genocide. It's called America and the Age of Genocide, and it talks about the genocides in Rwanda and elsewhere around the world, and how America deals with those kinds of things. So, those are a couple of books that you might pick up by ordering either an online version or the hard copy of the book. I'd also mention that Samantha Power was
here
with us at a World Affairs Council event. So that's the level of quality of speakers we get at our in-person events. And until we resume our in-person events, our town halls at Belmont University, we'll be bringing them to you in the video format here on Tuesday evenings at 7 o'clock. Again, Carl Dean, he'll be bringing you Global Nashville with Carl Dean on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. And then we'll alternate weeks with the Global Dialogue program, which is our Distinguished Visiting Speaker program. So we'll be talking to people, and one of the advantages of the video format is that we can reach out to people who we might not necessarily been able to afford to bring to Nashville for an in-person event. But you'll have an opportunity through the webinar to pose questions and comments and see what they've got to say. So keep that on your calendar. Tuesdays at 7 p.m. And global engagement. When is it, Dick?
It's gonna be next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. We'll see you there.
Live and in person.
Right.
We hope that you'll share this with your colleagues and your friends and other people who are staying at home, staying in place, observing the good social distancing, and we'll be back then and have more hot topics in the news.
Make sure I get the link. I'm going to send it to my grandchildren.
All right.
Because they're sitting home wondering, what do I do all day? Okay.
Ambassador Dick Bowers, thanks so much, and
thank you, Pat.
we will see you next week.